Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The first thing Sergeant Davin Crest became aware of was the ceiling. Not in any philosophical sense, not the ceiling as metaphor, not the ceiling as evidence of survival or symbol of continuation. Just the ceiling itself, pale and composite and humming faintly with recycled air. The kind of institutional surface that exists specifically to give recently conscious people something neutral to focus on while their nervous system files its damage reports. His nervous system had a great deal to report. It was taking its time about it. The second thing he became aware of was pain, which arrived not as a single sensation but as a committee, each member presenting its findings in sequence. His left side submitted its report first, and it was extensive. His head followed with a document that was shorter but strongly worded. His right hand, somewhat mysteriously, registered a complaint he could not immediately locate the origin of, and then went quiet, as though embarrassed to have spoken. The third thing, and this was the thing that pulled his returning consciousness away from the ceiling and the committee and the careful, incremental process of remembering that he was a person, was a voice. It was close, closer than made immediate sense, positioned somewhere in the proximity of his left ear. Low and precise and speaking in a language his translator implant took longer than usual to process. He could feel the implant working, that familiar warmth behind his temple, the half-second delay that always preceded complex phrasing, the faint sensation of the device cycling through candidate translations like a man shuffling cards before selecting one he wasn't confident about. 3 renderings came and went in the space of a breath. Then the implant settled with what Davin could only interpret as reluctance on the following: "You belong to me now." He stared at the ceiling. The ceiling offered nothing. His first coherent thought was that his translator implant had sustained damage, which was plausible given that apparently the rest of him had as well. His second thought was that the phrase had some innocent contextual meaning he was not yet conscious enough to access, something procedural, something medical, something that would resolve into mundanity the moment he had more blood in his brain and more brain in his head. His third thought arrived approximately 2 seconds later and was simply, "That's Sira." It was her voice. He knew it with the certainty of 7 months of briefings, 7 months of mission debriefs, 7 months of standing in the same room while she corrected his pronunciation of her name with the patient, faintly pained expression of a linguist watching someone fold a map the wrong way. Liaison Officer Sira Vale, Velhari Diplomatic Embed, the most professionally composed person he had ever worked alongside, which made the words his implant had just produced feel like finding formal correspondence written in crayon. He turned his head. The motion cost him more than he budgeted for, and he made a sound that he would, in retrospect, describe as tactical rather than pained. She was sitting in a chair beside his medical bed. Not standing, sitting, with the particular quality of someone who had been sitting there for some time and had settled into it with intent. She was watching his face with both rings of her iris fully contracted, that layered, deep-focused gaze that always made him feel like a document being read very carefully, and her expression was doing something he had no file for. Relief was in it. Something else was in it, something that sat behind the relief like a second room behind an open door. She looked, as she always did, almost human. Almost was doing significant work in that sentence. The architecture was familiar, the bilateral symmetry, the recognizable emotional geography of her face. But the bioluminescent patterns along her jaw shifted in the ambient light, slow-moving threads of soft illumination that her species had developed in low-light environments and simply never stopped using, because evolution does not take suggestions. Her dark gold eyes held that second iris ring, which contracted and expanded on its own logic, independent of the outer one, giving her gaze a depth that humans consistently interpreted as either profound attention or predatory calculation. Her hair black, the particular black of space between stars, moved in small, unhurried ways that had nothing to do with the medbay's ventilation, responsive to electromagnetic fields the way ordinary hair responded to wind. A constant subtle animation that made her look as though she existed at a slightly different frame rate than everything else in the room. She did not seem surprised that he was awake. She seemed, if anything, as though she had been waiting for him to reach this moment and had prepared several things to say once he arrived. "You're awake," she said, in standard carefully. "Good." A pause. "We need to talk about what happens next." Davin considered this. His left side continued its report. His head maintained its position. Somewhere beyond the medbay door, two people were arguing about calibration tolerances with the exhausted conviction of a disagreement that had been going on since before he went down. "Could we," he said, and his voice arrived rougher than intended, "start with water?" She produced a cup from the table beside her without looking away from his face. It had been sitting there already, waiting, positioned ready. He took it. He drank. He looked at the cup and then at her and then at the small plant on the windowsill beside the bed, silver-edged leaves catching the light, which had definitely not been there before he lost consciousness and was definitely hers. "How long?" he said. 51 hours, she replied. He processed this. And he began, gesturing vaguely at his left side, which was still in the middle of its presentation. "You'll have full function," she said. "The reconstruction is clean, the scarring is minimal." Another pause, and then in the tone of someone adding a footnote they consider relevant. "I did most of it myself, in the field, under active fire." She said this the way someone might mention they had taken an alternate route to avoid traffic, completely matter of fact, entirely devastating. Davin looked at her. She looked back. The patterns at her jaw pulsed faintly, once in a color he did not yet have the vocabulary to read. "That's," he said. "That's thank you." "Yes," she agreed, "and also," she straightened very slightly in her chair, "we should discuss the other part." The other part, it turned out, required context. Sierra Vale was not a woman who delivered information without foundation, who handed over conclusions before the architecture supporting them was fully constructed and load-bearing. She began, as she always did in briefings, at the beginning, and the beginning was the battlefield. And the battlefield was the place Davin's memory had decided, with considerable editorial authority, to mostly remove. He had fragments. The eastern perimeter. The sound of suppressive fire coming from an angle that didn't match the tactical projection. A smell, burnt composite, and something chemical he hadn't identified in the moment and couldn't identify now. Then nothing. The nothing was absolute and clean. The way unconsciousness is when the brain has decided that preserving the experience is not worth the storage space. Sierra filled in the rest without drama, in the sequential, evidence-first manner of her incident reports, which he had been reading for 7 months, and which had always impressed him with their precision, and faintly unnerved him with their complete absence of anything resembling emotional residue. She had been at the rear of the formation. His biomonitor signal had flatlined for 6 seconds before partially recovering. He had been 30 meters inside the contested zone. Active engagement was ongoing on 3 sides. His emergency implant systems had taken shrapnel damage and were operating. She said this without inflection, as a number at 19%. 19, Davin repeated. 19, she confirmed. He thought about what 19% of his emergency systems meant in practical terms, and decided, on reflection, that the brain's editorial decision to remove the preceding 40 seconds had been a reasonable one. She had gone in after him, across ground that the unit's tactical overlay had, at that moment, flagged in the specific shade of red that the system reserved for areas it considered non-survivable, which was a category the software used sparingly, because its designers had understood that calling something non-survivable has a measurable effect on whether anyone attempts to survive it. She had dragged him out, performed field stabilization with equipment from her own kit, and maintained manual cardiac intervention for 40 minutes during extraction, because 19% was not a number that could be trusted to finish a job without supervision. 40 minutes was a long time. He understood this in the abstract. He was a medic. He had done field intervention. He knew the physical cost of 40 uninterrupted minutes of manual cardiac support under ideal conditions. The conditions had not been ideal. She described them the way she described everything, without performance, in plain language that somehow made the plainness worse, because there was nothing decorative softening the shape of what she was saying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you seems insufficient." "It is," she agreed, and before he could decide how to respond to that, she continued, "What I need to tell you is not about gratitude. It's about consequence." He had been in the military long enough to understand that consequence was rarely a word that preceded good news. He settled against his pillow and gave her his full attention, which was all he currently had to offer. The Velhari had a principle, she told him. Older than their written law, which itself predated most of what humanity had been doing when it was still working out agriculture. It was embedded in their behavioral biology, the way certain things are when a species has carried them long enough. Not a rule exactly, not a custom exactly, but a structure that the culture had grown around so completely that removing it would require removing the culture as well. The principle concerned the preservation of life at personal risk. When a Velhari saved another's life in combat, not incidentally, not professionally, but deliberately, at genuine cost to their own survival, it created what translated into standard as a claim. She paused when she said the word. He noticed the pause. "A claim," he said carefully, the way a man steps onto ice he isn't certain about. "The translation is imprecise," she said, which he was beginning to understand was her version of bracing someone for impact. She explained it in layers, the way you explain something that doesn't have a shape a listener's existing vocabulary can hold. It was not ownership in any sense his framework would recognize, and here she paused again, and then added, with the deliberate honesty he would come to understand was one of her most fundamental qualities. It was not ownership either. It was permanent. It was recognized by her culture as more binding than contract, more durable than family designation. The rescued party did not choose it. The rescuer did not choose it in the moment of choosing to act. The claim was the consequence of the action, automatic. The way falling is the consequence of stepping off a ledge, and it would be strange to say you had chosen to fall. He stared at her. She waited with the patience of someone who had prepared for the stare. "And this applies," he said slowly, "to me." "The diplomatic accords include an interspecies provision," she said, and something in the efficiency with which she produced this information told him she had been ready for this question, that she had, in fact, been ready for all of his questions, and was experiencing no pleasure in having predicted them correctly. The provision had been negotiated over 11 years, she explained. It existed because the alternative, Velhari soldiers allowing Allied personnel to die rather than incur the obligations of rescue, had been considered strategically problematic by both parties. The provision had been invoked 4 times before today. "How do you know it's 4?" he asked. "I looked it up," she said, a pause. "This morning." "This morning," he repeated. "You looked up the interspecies claiming precedence this morning." "I wanted to be precise," she said, which was the most Sierra Vale sentence she had ever produced in his presence. And he found, unexpectedly, in the midst of processing the information that he had woken up as someone's permanent legal responsibility, that he almost smiled. He pressed one hand over his eyes instead, because the ceiling and the committee and the situation all required a moment of darkness. "So practically speaking," he said into the cup of his palm, "what does belonging to you actually mean?" When he lowered his hand, she was watching him with that layered gaze, both iris rings doing their separate work. The bioluminescent patterns at her collarbone were moving slowly, rhythmically, the pace of careful thought. On the windowsill, the silver-leaved plant held very still. "It means," she said, that you are my responsibility, permanently, and that I am the patterns at her jaw shifted briefly through something warmer, yours to rely on, in ways my culture considers non-negotiable. She let this sit for a moment. Then, with the precision of someone adding a footnote they have debated including, it also means that the next time you walk into a non-survivable grid reference, I am, by cultural law, obligated to follow you in. He looked at her. Doesn't that seem like a design flaw? The inner ring of her iris did something that, he would later learn, constituted a Velhari expression of reluctant acknowledgement. Several philosophers have raised the point, she said. The station found out on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate, because Tuesday was the day of the week that had the least dignity to begin with. Davin was cleared for light duty on the morning of the fourth day, which his body disputed and his medical record permitted, and which Sira allowed with the expression of someone who had calculated the probability of him staying in bed voluntarily and arrived at a number too small to argue against. He walked out of the medbay under his own power, which he considered a personal victory of significant proportion, and within the hour he understood that forward station Calix had, in his absence, become very interested in his personal situation. The first indication was Corporal Mays, who greeted him in the corridor outside the equipment bay with an expression that contained too much information for a face that was trying to appear casual. Mays was 23 and incapable of concealment in the way that some people are incapable of carrying a tune, not for lack of effort, but for a fundamental structural incompatibility between intention and result. "Sergeant," Mays said. "Mays," Davin said. A pause of roughly 2 seconds in which Mays visibly decided against whatever he had been planning to say and substituted something safer. "Good to have you back, Sergeant." "Thank you, Mays." Another pause. "So is it true that she—" "No," Davin said, and kept walking, though he did not yet know what specific version of the story Mays had received, which meant he had technically denied something without knowing its content, which was a tactic he immediately recognized as something Sira would describe as epistemically irresponsible. The versions multiplied throughout the day with the creative efficiency of a rumor ecosystem operating at full capacity. By mid-morning, the story had accumulated a Velhari bonding ritual that had allegedly taken place in the medbay, details of which varied significantly by source and reached, in at least one telling, a level of ceremonial complexity that would have required significantly more square footage than the room contained. By midday, there was a version involving a formal declaration before senior Velhari command, which was inaccurate but at least structurally plausible. By afternoon, someone had introduced the element of a territorial marker, which Davin tracked back to Private Owen, who had clearly been accessing Velhari cultural databases with more enthusiasm than comprehension. He found Sira in the tactical planning room, standing at the projection table with a holographic sector map rotating slowly above its surface, making notes on a datapad with the focused quiet of someone who had decided the most effective response to institutional curiosity was to simply continue working. The luminescent patterns along her jaw were steady and even. She had, apparently, achieved a level of equanimity about the situation that he had not yet reached, which was either admirable or suspicious. "There's a version going around," he told her, "in which you performed a 7-part ritual." "I'm aware," she said, without looking up from the datapad. "Lieutenant Guerin asked me about it this morning. I told him the accurate version." A pause. He seemed disappointed. "The accurate version is also fairly remarkable." "Yes," she said, with the tone of someone acknowledging a fact they find neither remarkable nor unremarkable, because they have not yet developed the distance to assess it. "But it has fewer candles, apparently, which reduces its appeal." He stood beside her at the projection table and looked at the rotating sector map, which showed the eastern perimeter in the particular clarity of post-engagement analysis, the kind of rendering that made everything look orderly and comprehensible in a way that active situations never did. He found the grid reference. He looked at it for a moment. "Commander Yalish wants to see me," he said. "She saw me this morning," Sierra said, and the way she said it, completed, past tense, filed, told him the shape of that conversation before he walked into its echo. Commander Yalish received him behind her desk with the expression of someone who had made peace with logistics that were beyond her authority, and was now managing her feelings about that outcome. She was a compact, precise woman who communicated a great deal through the quality of her silences, and the silence she opened with was the kind that meant she had read everything, consulted everyone relevant, and arrived at a position she intended to hold with minimal discussion. She had reviewed the Accord provisions, she told him. She had spoken with Velhari Command. His assignments were unchanged. His chain of command was unchanged. His record would carry a notation, the language of which had been agreed upon by both parties and which she read aloud to him in the flat tone of official language being handled carefully, like something that might react badly to inflection. What changed, she said, was the permanent attachment of Liaison Officer Vale to his unit's operational roster, a request which Velhari Command had approved in the same hour it was submitted. "She submitted it 3 days before I woke up," Davin said, because Yalish had not mentioned this and he was curious whether she knew. Yalish looked at him. 4 days before, she said, he absorbed this. Sierra had submitted the paperwork one day after pulling him out of the engagement zone, while he was still unconscious, while the outcome was still uncertain, which meant she had not waited to see if he survived before arranging to remain close to him, and he was not certain what to do with that piece of information, except to set it down somewhere careful inside himself and leave it there. Yalish dismissed him with the additional observation that she expected professionalism from everyone on her station, a statement she delivered with the emphasis of someone who had said something more specific than its surface suggested. He agreed that professionalism was reasonable and left. The adjustment, as he experienced it over the following days, was not what he had constructed in his imagination during his recovery. Sierra did not hover. She did not surveil. She operated, as she always had, with efficiency and precision, and what changed was only the radius of that efficiency, which had expanded to include him in ways that were practical, specific, and almost entirely deniable as anything other than professional consideration. Almost. He noticed that she appeared at mealtimes, not always at the same table, sometimes nearby, sometimes across the room, but present, her tray selected with more attention than the mess hall's offerings typically warranted. He noticed that his medical kit had been reorganized sometime between his 3rd and 4th morning back, in a system that was objectively superior to his own, and which he refused to acknowledge verbally, because acknowledging it felt like conceding a point in a negotiation whose terms he hadn't fully read yet. He noticed that when he was doing something she had apparently assessed as above acceptable risk, recalibrating the external sensor array on the station's upper hull in winds that were at the high end of permitted operational range. She appeared in the access corridor below and stood there without comment, arms folded, until he climbed down. When he reached the bottom, she simply walked away, as though she had happened to be passing. "You know," he said to her back, "I've been managing my own survival for 31 years. She paused without turning. "With variable success," she said, and continued walking, and he stood at the base of the access ladder with 31 years of survival instinct and no available counterargument, which was, he was beginning to understand, a condition she produced with some regularity. What surprised him most was the humor. 7 months of professional distance had given him a version of Sierra Vale that was capable and precise, and about as warm as a tactical display. And this version was not inaccurate so much as incomplete in the way that a blueprint is incomplete, structurally faithful, but missing the quality of light in the actual rooms. The woman who appeared now was still precise, still direct, still capable of delivering statements with the force of blunt instruments, but she was also, and this took him longer to accept than the claiming provision itself, genuinely, quietly funny. There was the afternoon she attempted to explain the claim to the unit's medical officer, Lieutenant Barris, and a translation error in her implant's standard output rendered her as declaring that she was Davin's furniture rather than his ward, which she corrected in 30 seconds with an expression of concentrated mortification she clearly believed was invisible. There was the evening he caught her reading a human relationship psychology text on her datapad with the focused intensity she normally brought to tactical analysis. And when he asked what she was reading, she rotated the screen away from him with a speed that was not as casual as she intended it to be. And he said nothing, because some observations are more valuable kept than spent. There was the moment she told him that the claiming tradition was, in her culture, celebrated rather than complicated. That Velhari who had been claimed were considered fortunate. That the literature medic long enough to understand the taxonomy of operational optimism. Routine meant low probability. Low probability meant someone had run the numbers and felt comfortable with them. And feeling comfortable with numbers was the specific variety of confidence that the universe tended to find most instructive to correct. He said none of this during the briefing. He checked his kit, which was organized in Sierra's system now, a fact he had stopped pretending required acknowledgement, and he fell in with the unit at 600 under a sky that the station's atmospheric processors were rendering in the pale gray of early function, the artificial dawn that always felt slightly unconvinced of itself, like a painting of morning rather than the thing itself. Sierra moved at his left. She had moved at his left for 3 weeks now, a positioning so consistent that the rest of the unit had quietly adjusted their formation around it, the way water adjusts around a stone, not dramatically, not with comment, simply as a fact of the terrain. Corporal Mays had once asked Davin whether the left side was a Velhari cultural designation, and Davin had said he didn't know, and had then not asked Sierra, because some questions felt like opening a door before you were ready for the room behind it. The corridor was unremarkable for 40 minutes. Unremarkable in the way of things that are accumulating pressure they have not yet released. The tactical overlay on Davin's helmet display showed green across its contact probability indicators with the confidence of a system that was about to revise its position significantly. It revised its position at the 41-minute mark, at which point green became amber became red in the sequential urgency of a display that had decided to compress several stages of concern into approximately 4 seconds. The contact was loud and immediate and came from the left, which was the direction Sierra was standing, which meant she was between it and him before he had completed the cognitive step of registering that there was a between to occupy. He did not process this as a decision on her part. It was too fast for decision. It was the kind of movement that lives below decision, in the layer where long practice and something older than practice exist together without distinguishing themselves. He did not go down. This was the central fact of the next 12 minutes, around which everything else organized itself. He stayed operational. He moved where he was supposed to move, treated what he was supposed to treat, made the calls that the situation required and made them in the right sequence and with the right information. And when the contact broke and the unit pulled back to extraction, he was standing on his own feet with his own momentum carrying him forward and the overlay returning, grudgingly, toward green. The transport back to station was loud with the specific noise of people who have come through something, and are using volume to confirm to each other and themselves that they have in fact come through it. Someone was telling a story about the angle of the first contact burst that was already funnier than the experience had been, which was how these stories always worked, comedy being the fastest route from having survived something to being able to hold it at the distance required for continued functioning. Sierra sat beside him, closer than the available space required. The bioluminescent patterns along her jaw were running the pale, rapid sequence he had learned to read as her adrenaline processing, the biological equivalent of hands that won't quite stop shaking, rendered in light instead of motion. She was looking at the transport's middle distance with the expression of someone reviewing an internal record they are not yet ready to file. He waited. He had learned, in 3 weeks of close proximity to Sierra Vale, that she arrived at things in her own sequence, and that the sequence was always worth waiting for. "You didn't need me," she said eventually. Not accusation, not relief exactly. Something that was examining itself while she said it, turning the observation over in the light. He thought about the 7 months before he went down on the eastern perimeter. The version of himself that had stood in briefings beside a Velhari liaison officer and processed her as a professional feature of the operational landscape, competent and precise, and located at a courteous distance that he had never thought to question, because the distance had seemed mutual, and mutual distance is comfortable in the way that comfortable things are, unchallenged, unexamined, quietly limiting. He thought about what it had taken to move him from that version to this one, and whether the movement had required what it required, or whether he had simply needed the right occasion for something that was already prepared to happen. "I didn't need you to pull me out," he said. "That's true." He paused. "That's not the same thing as not needing you." The patterns at her collarbone did something slow and warm that spread without urgency, a color he had no standard word for, and which the Velhari language, he was given to understand, had several. It was the first time he had seen this particular response from her, which told him it was not one she produced often, which told him something about the specific weight of what he had just said landing in her specific internal architecture. She was quiet for long enough that the transport covered considerable ground. Around them, the unit's noise continued its cheerful, necessary work of transforming recent danger into retrospective anecdote. Someone had started ranking the tactical overlay's color transitions by dramatic timing, and the ranking was receiving the serious critical engagement it deserved. "The claim," Sierra said, in the voice she used when she was choosing precision over convenience, "is described in my culture as acquisition. The rescuer acquires the rescued. This is accurate as far as it goes." She looked at him directly, both iris rings doing their layered, separate work. "But the reason the tradition carries the weight it does, the reason it is coded as deeply as it is because my people believe that the choice to risk yourself for another changes both of you permanently. That something is created in that moment that did not exist before." A pause. The warm patterns had not receded. "I chose you specifically, before you went down, before there was anything to rescue." She said this the way she said things that cost her something, evenly, precisely, without softening, because softening would have been a way of protecting herself from the exposure of saying the true thing in plain language. "The tradition does not require me to disclose that. I am disclosing it because I have spent 3 weeks reading 63 volumes of Velhari literature on the subject, and the consistent conclusion across all canonical texts is that the claimed party deserves accurate information." He looked at her for a moment. "All 63, he said. "I had 51 hours while you were unconscious," she said, "and I read quickly." The transport moved through the dark between the contested corridor and the station, carrying its cargo of loud, surviving soldiers and one conversation that was quieter than anything else in the vehicle. He thought about the plant with the silver-edged leaves, still on the windowsill of his quarters where she had moved it the day he was discharged, and how he had not moved it back, and how she had not commented on the fact that he had not moved it back, and how the silence around that small fact had been, in its own way, a conversation they had both been participating in for weeks, without formally acknowledging it was happening. He reached over and covered her hand with his. It was a simple thing. He was a medic, and he understood that simple interventions, correctly timed, carried disproportionate weight. Her patterns responded before she did. That slow, warm bloom, spreading from her collarbone upward, uncontrolled in the way that genuine things are uncontrolled, without the regulation she applied to most of her visible responses. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She did not move away, which from Sierra Vale, who maintained her perimeter with the consistency of a well-calibrated sensor array, was the equivalent of a declaration in full. "I'm going to need to learn the language properly," he said, "not just what the implant manages, actually." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. "Velhari has 63 tonal variations for states of attachment alone," she said. "Achieving conversational fluency in that register will take years." He thought about this. He thought about the eastern perimeter, and the ceiling and the committee of pain, and the voice in his ear that his implant had rendered imperfectly, and that he had understood, even concussed and reconstructed and operating on insufficient information, as something more layered than the words themselves. He thought about 40 minutes of manual intervention under fire, and a plain